and welcome back to my channel. This is Marla. I'm so glad that you've joined me today. We are going to create an easy faux wood grain background. I'll be using some products from Papertrey Ink and some ink from Pink Fresh Studio to complete my card today. I started with the Feathered Friends Mini 15, which is a layering stamp set of this beautiful bird. I did stamp my image using some of the colors that I'll be using in my background today, and I did this off camera. I used my Brother Scan and Cut to cut out the pieces. I have the You Are On My Mind sentiment set. This is a wonderful all occasion stamp set. Papertrey Ink has some of the best price points when it comes to some sentiment stamp sets, and I love this one. The beautiful Elegant Edges Spring Flowers is going to give me a touch of softness on this card. And finally, I have the Into the Blooms Cherry Blossoms for those florals that I love. From Pink Fresh Studio, I'm using the mini ink cubes in Warm Buff Doe Gathered Twigs, Sage, Eucalyptus, Olive, Waterfall, Storm, Paradise, and Atlantis. I did again use the greens and blues on my bird when I did my stamping. I have a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of accent opaque cardstock. I'm using the Atlantis mini ink cube to create my faux wood grain background. Mine are non-traditional colors. You can see that I am lightly swiping in a vertical motion down my card panel. This next color is Warm Buff. When the Warm Buff overlaps, and I am overlapping my colors, when the Warm Buff overlaps over the blue, it does create a green. And again, I did use green on my card, so again, we're just repeating colors in this panel. You can use traditional colors of grays and browns, and it's going to give you a more traditional wood grain feel. The harder you press, obviously, the darker the colors. So there were some areas where I used the Waterfall and the Warm Buff, and I wanted it a little bit darker where it was overlapping. So I did start out light, and then I went back over some of those areas with a just more pressure on the ink cube. So here is our faux wood grain background. I wanted to add some water splatters. I added some large ones to the back using my Distress sprayer, and I am using my Ranger Heat tool to heat this. I did set it aside, and I will add it to an A2 top folding card base, which is going to be 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. The Spring Flowers Elegant Edges die comes with 3 pieces. The solid, which I did cut out of accent opaque cardstock, and then there is a top edge, so you can choose to cut out both edges of this image. You can choose to just cut the image out and leave your card panel solid. For my card, I did add the image more towards the bottom of my panel, as you can see, and then I used the top edger to cut that out. I want to add color to my background because this is going to be see how it's lacy and it's see-through. So if I were to put it on my wood grain panel, the wood grain's going to show behind it, and that tends to mute the images. And this is absolutely gorgeous. The floral on this is so beautiful that I wanted to make sure that I highlighted it. And in order to do so, I needed to cut a panel that was going to align perfectly with the front panel. And so having that separate edger is allowing me that solid image that I'm looking for. I can align it easily with my die cut. I'll remove that die cut and just run it through my die cutting machine. And just like that, I have that perfectly aligned background that we can now color. Now, there are several different flowers on this, and I wanted to repeat the blues. This time I'm adding a darker blue that I didn't use on my wood grain background. This is called Atlantis, and where my larger flower is, I'm adding a concentration, really deep tones of that Atlantis. This background is going to look really splotchy, and for the most part it doesn't matter because what I'm doing is starting in the center of some of the flowers with a more heavy hand, and then I lighten it up as I go towards the outer petals, and that's just going to add a little bit more variation in the colors instead of just keeping the same concentration or pressure on my blending brush. By adding ink in a lighter, softer motion in the outer areas, it is going to just create more interest on the background. So I just realign my die cut image over the top of this background, and I continue working through my colors. I'm adding a little bit of Paradise, which is just a bluer version of the Atlantis, so more of a blue teal. And then I will bring in a little bit of that Waterfall. So as I continue to align this, I'm seeing where the flowers are, where I need to add those colors of blue. And then once I finish with that, I'll have white areas all over that background, and those are going to be my leaves. So I'll clean off my blending brush, and I'm going to bring in some sage, which is one of my favorite new colors this year. I don't know what it's been about this color, but I just want to use it on everything. So I did bring in the sage, and you'll see that I'm just going to lightly go over the background. And the reason that I'm going lighter with the green and I'm not being as heavy-handed initially is because there were some areas where I got the blue where I misaligned, where I needed to add the blue. And so I have a couple of leaves that have, well, actually one in particular that has a really harsh edge, and I want to make sure that I'm going to not do that with the green and overlap some of the blue areas and end up with a harsh line. So I'm going to start out really light-handed. You can see that dark area towards the bottom right, and what I ended up doing was bringing in a darker eucalyptus color, and I was just heavier handed in that area where that blue overlapped where the leaf was. You can see that dark green, and those areas just blended those darker colors in with my the darker blue with the darker green. So I finished my blending, and I just need to glue my panel on. So I'm going to use my art glitter glue in order to do that. Adding the glue to the outside edge, and then I'm not worried about getting all of the particular areas of the center. If my edges are adhered, then the rest of the panel is going to be just fine. So I'll align this with my background, and then I'll just press it down, make sure that it's aligned perfectly. I'll flip it over, and I'll start adding some foam tape because you know I love my dimension. And while I'm adding that foam tape, I did want to mention about this die cut image. I did use the 110-pound accent opaque cardstock to cut it out. I tried using an 80-pound cardstock and some shims, and I really wasn't able to get all of the pieces. There were areas in the image that I wasn't able to, it didn't cut all the way through. And so I found that by using a heavier cardstock and the shims that I was able to easily get the image die cut out. So that was just a little bit of a tip that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned, that you should use a little bit heavier of a cardstock if you're having problems with an intricate die not cutting. Even with shims, if you use a heavier cardstock, then it tends to work much better. So I'll remove the release paper from the back of my image, and then we're going to align it using our MISTI to the bottom of this card panel. And see how pretty, because the colors are just absolutely beautiful. The teals and the sage greens are just so pretty together. And then having that white that breaks it up really does add a lot to this background. So I've die cut my cherry blossoms, and I have the largest twig I'm going to use some of the same colors again, just repeating colors. So I'm starting with a darker, which is called Gathered Twigs, and then I'm going to add a little bit of the dough. I end up covering up most of this, so you're really not going to see the color variation. Well, actually, I must have started with the dough, and now I'm adding the Gathered Twigs. But you're not going to really see a lot of this variation. It does dry back quite a bit, and I probably could have went back in with it. But, you know, once you start getting into the assembly mode, you really don't, well, I should say I don't really look at some of those details that I wanted to add, and visually most of that dark ink was ended up being covered up. But so I'm going to blend back in a little bit more of these colors, just trying to make sure that the edges aren't really harsh and I have a nice variation of color. And we'll move on to our cherry blossoms. There's 3 different sizes of cherry blossoms. There's one that's a full cherry blossom, and then there are a couple that are kind of like half, what appear to me to be half cherry blossoms. So I'm going to get these onto my Altenew mat. So this is my mat from the stamp wheel, and it really does hold my images. I was using a Cricut mat for years and years and years. I learned that from Betsy Veldman, but I find that this mat just works so much better. Not only does it hold my die cut pieces, but it also holds my ink cubes in place. Sometimes these, with my nails, these little ink cubes are a little bit harder to hold on to when I'm trying to do some ink blending. So I find that this Altenew mat just works beautifully. I'm going to start with the backgrounds. So these are the solid layers of the cherry blossoms, and I'm using Storm, which is a gray blue. And you'll notice that I really don't worry. I never worry when I'm doing this type of ink blending onto florals or die cut pieces, whether I have a perfect blend, because I do tend to use multiple colors. I'm going to add a little bit of that Paradise because I want some of that teal in with the blue. Because I didn't use that solid blue in the background, just incorporating a little bit of that teal is going to change the tone of my colors. And I'm going to do the same thing to all of these backgrounds. Now, I wasn't sure how many of the cherry blossoms I was going to use, or, you know, I just die cut a few of them and I just, you know, start coloring. I don't know about you, but I don't really plan out my cards. Sometimes I pull pieces that I want to use and see if they're going to work together, but I don't really have like a full card design in mind. Sometimes most of the time, I just sit down, look at products that I haven't used or I want to use, and I will start creating with those. So I wasn't quite sure how these were going to fit on my card panel with the rest of the images that I already had in place, but I can always use them on another project. So again, adding more of that Paradise. I have a couple, the top layers, I'm going to be adding a little bit more of the teal to those, so I was a little bit more light-handed with the Storm. And then for those centers up towards the top, I am going to, I believe, either use Dough or Warm Buff and the Gathered Twigs. So a combination of those 3 browns. I could have changed it to add a little bit more green to those areas, but I thought that we needed a little bit more of the brown in the card, and so I just went ahead and just added the brown. So these are not traditional cherry blossom colors, but a flower is a flower is a flower as far as I'm concerned. Here I'm adding, I believe, the sage. I'll add some eucalyptus, and then I'll add a little bit of depth with the olive to my leaves. I am going to complete my card off camera, so I will assemble the card off camera. For my sentiment, I did use my Hero Arts oval infinity dies, and I used one of the smaller ovals to have a place to stamp my sentiment, because I do have so much going on with the wood grain background and with the spring flowers die cut image at the bottom. I needed something to help me for my image to, for my sentiment to land on, to make sure that it didn't get lost in everything else that was going on. So I did use those infinity dies, and I stamped the sentiment that said, "You've been on my mind a lot lately." I did want to mention what some of the sentiments are in this "You Are on My Mind" sentiment set. These are typically, I think they're like $5 over at Papertrey Ink. And this one has, "You've been on my mind a lot lately. It's always nice to have someone in your life who makes you smile, even when they're not around. Thoughts of you occupy my mind each day, on my mind and in my heart. I hope you are doing wonderfully well. My day is often touched by warm thoughts of you. You are my happy place." So there are several beautiful sentiments in this. I would encourage you to just head over to Papertrey Ink. Again, I'll have the link in the description box below, and just take a look at their little sentiment sets. If you're, looking for specific types of sentiments, they have a plethora of whether they're faith-based sentiments, whether they're thinking of you, sympathy. They have so many beautiful sentiments. I think they're one of the companies that I love most. The other one that I've noticed is Sweet and Sassy. If you like faith-based sentiments, they have some amazing sentiments as well. So here I'm just adding some splatters, because that's just what I do. I love adding splatters to my background pieces. And here, or to my ink blended pieces, here I'm showing you where I used that oval die to cut out the cardstock for my sentiment, so I have a place for my sentiment to land. Again, I used my brother's Scan and Cut to cut out my bird. For the wing, I stamped the wing out separately so that I was able to use my brother's Scan and Cut to cut just the wing out, and I added some dimension behind that. I added dimension behind my sentiment. The little leaves behind my sentiment come from the spring flowers. So those are some of the leaves that cut out of that background piece. I added some foam tape behind some of the leaves for my cherry blossoms, and that completes my card for today. So here is the dimension. I like to show that because I do add a lot of dimension to my cards, which always makes my heart happy. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section. I'll show you a couple of close-ups of my cards, and until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day. Thanks again for watching.